welcome to West Film. We bring you the best movie recaps, reviews, ending explained videos, and hidden details from your favorite films. If you love great movies, subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a new upload. Now grab some popcorn, and let's jump into today's movie. Kennedy's career before this film was built mostly on supporting roles in westerns and television series. He often played tough, physically imposing characters, but rarely ones with much emotional depth. His casting in this role changed that. Kennedy delivers one of the most dynamic performances in the film, starting out as a rival figure, almost a stand-in for the prison system's internal hierarchy before gradually becoming Luke's most loyal supporter. His emotional breakdown after Luke's punishment is one of the film's most powerful moments, and that performance won him an Academy Award for Best Supporting Actor, launching him into decades of recognizable Hollywood work. Another key figure is Strether Martin, who plays the captain, the prison authority responsible for enforcing discipline. Martin was already a prolific character actor before this film, frequently cast in westerns and TV shows. Known for a soft-spoken voice and calm demeanor he often used to make authority figures feel unsettling. His performance here is chilling precisely because of its restraint rather than a loud or aggressive villain. He embodies bureaucratic control, cold, procedural, emotionally detached. His calm delivery of the punishment rules, in particular, helped define his career afterward, and he became known for similar authoritarian or morally ambiguous roles throughout the 1970s. The supporting cast also includes Dennis Hopper as Babalu Gatz, one of the younger inmates. At the time, Hopper was still early in his career, not yet the counterculture icon he'd become after directing and starring in Easy Rider, 1969. His role here is small but meaningful in retrospect, since it links the film to the emerging youth rebellion cinema of the late 60s. Hopper brought a restless, unpredictable energy even in this minor part, rawness that was less controlled than Newman's or Kennedy's, but which would later become central to his identity as a filmmaker and actor tied to the American counterculture. Harry Dean Stanton also appears, in a minor role as one of the inmates. He was still building his career at the time through small television and film parts, not yet the legendary character actor he'd become in films like Paris, Texas, 1984. Even in this early appearance, though, his naturalistic style comes through. He often played understated, working-class characters, and this part fits that early pattern. The ensemble is crucial to the film's realism. Rather than leaning on theatrical performances, the actors together build a believable social world inside the prison. Many of the supporting cast weren't major stars at the time, which only adds to the authenticity of the prison. Feels populated by real people rather than Hollywood types. Cool Hand Luke had a real impact on its cast's careers. For Paul Newman, it reinforced his standing as a leading actor capable of carrying morally complex stories. For George Kennedy, it turned him from a reliable supporting player into an Oscar-winning performer. For Strether Martin, it cemented his niche playing controlled, authoritarian characters. For younger actors like Hopper and Stanton, it became part of the foundation for much bigger careers in New Hollywood. What makes the cast especially notable is how their different career stages intersect within the film. Established stars at their peak, character actors defining their signature style, and emerging talents on the edge of breakthrough, all in the same story. That mix adds to the film's lasting realism and emotional weight. In a way, the casting mirrors the film's central theme of individuality within systems. Each actor represents a different relationship to Hollywood itself as stardom, craft, emerging talent, evolving identity, together forming a layered performance structure that elevates the film beyond a simple prison story into a study of human behavior under pressure. Cool Hand Luke, 1967, holds a unique place in American film history because its influence reaches well beyond cinema. It became a cultural touchstone, a kind of symbolic language for rebellion and a reference point for conversations about authority, individuality, and resistance, and that impact hasn't been limited to audiences of the late 1960s. It continues to shape modern storytelling, visual symbolism, and everyday expressions of defiance. The film arrived during a period of intense social and political change in America. The 1960s were defined by civil rights movements, anti-war protests, and growing distrust of institutions, and against that backdrop, the story of Luke Jackson, a man who refuses to conform to a rigid prison system, resonated deeply. The film never explicitly framed itself as political, but its themes lined up strongly with the cultural mood of questioning authority. Part of why it became so culturally significant is that it presented rebellion in a calm, almost effortless way. Luke isn't a revolutionary leader in the traditional sense. He's not organizing a movement or giving speeches. His resistance is personal, persistent, and symbolic. And that kind of rebellion reflected a real shift in how audiences were thinking about resistance in the late 60s, that even small acts of refusal could carry meaning within systems built on control. The line "what we have here is a failure to communicate," delivered by Strither Martin, became one of the most iconic in American film history. It entered everyday language as shorthand for misunderstandings, power struggles, and institutional breakdowns, and over time it's been used in political commentary, workplace conversations, and media satire. Its staying power shows how a single moment of dialogue can outgrow its original context and become part of the culture at large. Paul Newman's performance also contributed heavily to the film's cultural footprint. His Luke Jackson became an archetype, the cool rebel who resists authority not through violence or aggression, but through composure and humor. That archetype went on to shape later characters embodying quiet defiance, and the idea of the emotionally controlled rebel became a recurring motif in American storytelling. The film also reshaped prison narratives in cinema and TV. Before it, prison stories tended to focus on escape plots or crime and punishment morality tales. After its release, filmmakers began treating prisons as psychological environments where identity, power, and endurance took center stage. Later films like The Shawshank Redemption owe part of their narrative structure and emotional tone to the foundation this film laid. The boiled egg scene, where Luke eats an enormous number of eggs to prove his toughness, became a widely recognized cultural touchstone in its own right, echoed since in reality TV challenges, competitive eating, and even advertising. The moment represents more than physical endurance. It symbolizes the absurdity of proving worth within arbitrary systems, and its simplicity made it easy to carry into pop culture memory. The film's influence also reached into music, particularly around imagery of rebellion and solitude. Many rock and folk musicians of the late 60s and 70s drew on its themes indirectly through lyrics and visuals, so the image of a lone man resisting control became part of the broader counterculture identity, echoed on album covers, in concert visuals, and in music videos. In fashion and visual culture, Luke's prison uniform became symbolic of stripped identity and forced conformity. The imagery of men in identical clothing working under strict supervision has been reused across photography, editorial design, and film ever since, representing a loss of individuality under systems of control, a theme that still resonates in visual storytelling today. Politically, the film doesn't advocate a specific ideology, but it's been read from different angles. Some see it as a critique of authoritarian systems and rigid institutions, others as a meditation on the human spirit's capacity to endure hardship. That openness to interpretation is part of why it's stayed culturally relevant across decades. Its influence extends into language, too. Cool Hand Luke has become shorthand for someone who stays calm under pressure, used in sports commentary, business settings, and everyday conversation are a clear sign of how deeply the character has entered the culture. Films and TV shows have repeatedly referenced or paid homage to its scenes. The roadwork sequences, the oppressive heat, the chain gang dynamics have all been recreated or parodied across media. Even without a direct reference, its influence shows up in the structure of stories about rebellion within confined systems. The film also played an important part in the evolution of the anti-hero in American cinema. Before this era, heroes tended to be morally clear-cut. Afterward, audiences grew more accepting of protagonists who resist authority without fitting a traditional moral mold. Luke Jackson isn't a perfect character, but his flaws and strengths are exactly what make him compelling and relatable. The film helped push 1960s Hollywood toward more realistic, character-driven storytelling away from polished studio narratives and toward a grittier depiction of human struggle, which in turn helped shape new Hollywood cinema in the 1970s. With its focus on character psychology and social commentary. Even decades later, the film keeps turning up in modern TV, internet culture, and motivational discussions. Its message about persistence in the face of oppressive systems has been reinterpreted in corporate culture, sports psychology, and personal development, and Luke's refusal to break has become a broader metaphor for resilience. Ultimately, the film's lasting significance comes down to its simplicity. It doesn't rely on complex mythology or elaborate world building, just a single human struggle against a rigid environment, which is exactly what allows new generations to keep finding their own meaning in it. The Making of Cool Hand Luke, 1967, is full of behind-the-scenes stories that show just how carefully the filmmakers balanced realism, performance intensity, and controlled chaos. The final film feels smooth and natural, but getting there involved difficult shooting conditions, creative risk-taking, and a real commitment to authenticity from cast and crew alike. The film was directed by Stuart Rosenberg, who came from a television drama background before moving into features. That TV experience shaped his directing style, which emphasized efficiency, performance, and grounded storytelling over flashy visuals, an approach that suited this story well, since it leans on subtle emotional shifts rather than spectacle. The screenplay, adapted from a novel, was reworked significantly during development to lean into the psychological side of confinement and resistance. Early drafts apparently leaned more toward action and escape, but the final version became more introspective, focused on endurance and the dynamics between characters, which helped give the film its more philosophical tone. Filming took place mostly in Florida, where the production sought locations that could stand in for the harsh, humid environment of a southern chain gang prison. The heat wasn't just a backdrop, it actively shaped the production. Cast and crew worked under intense sun, and the physical discomfort helped actors convincingly portray exhaustion, sweat, and strain. Keeping continuity in those outdoor conditions was one of the toughest parts of the shoot. The roadwork scenes, where prisoners break asphalt in the sun, needed careful scheduling for consistent lighting while also protecting the cast from heat exhaustion. Even with precautions, the cast often worked long, physically demanding hours, which only added to how real the performances feel. Paul Newman insisted on doing many of his own physical scenes, manual labor, running, punishment sequence, choosing to experience the discomfort himself rather than lean on stand-ins or camera tricks. That commitment reinforced the film's grounded tone and helped keep the physical performances consistent. The now infamous egg-eating scene, where Luke eats an outrageous number of boiled eggs in a short time, took multiple takes and careful planning. It looks simple on screen, but getting there required real coordination to keep it safe and continuous. It became one of the film's most memorable moments, largely because of how raw and unglamorous the execution is. So it wasn't meant to be visually spectacular, just an emphasis on stubborn endurance under social pressure. The prison yard set was built with real attention to detail of buildings, fencing, surveillance structures are all designed to create a constant sense of observation and restricted movement. Even when the cameras weren't rolling, the set itself reinforced the psychological pressure the characters were living under. George Kennedy developed real off-screen camaraderie with several cast members, which helped the on-screen prison relationships feel more authentic. A lot of the interactions between inmates came not just from the script but from improvisation Rosenberg encouraged, letting natural chemistry emerge, especially in group scenes where hierarchy and tension mattered. One of the bigger production challenges was keeping the tone balanced. The film moves between humor, brutality, and reflection, and Rosenberg had to guide performances carefully so comedic beats didn't undercut the seriousness of the prison setting, and dramatic ones didn't feel overplayed. That balance is a big part of why the film feels emotionally layered rather than one note. The punishment sequences needed careful choreography to stay safe while still looking convincing. The restrained style of violence, where much of the brutality is implied rather than shown outright, was a deliberate creative choice that keeps the focus on emotional impact rather than graphic detail. The crew also had to work around sound recording challenges outdoors. Heat, wind, and ambient noise made clean dialogue hard to capture, so post-production dubbing and careful audio mixing were used to keep things clear without losing the natural atmosphere. Strither Martin brought a calm, almost procedural mindset to his role off-screen. He was known for a quiet professionalism that contrasted sharply with the authoritarian control he portrayed on camera, and that contrast helped make his performance believable. The production also benefited from having emerging actors like Dennis Hopper and Harry Dean Stanton, who weren't yet widely known and so could fully inhabit their characters without the baggage of celebrity. Costuming played a quiet but important role, too. The prison uniforms were designed to look worn and practical rather than stylized, and the repetition and lack of variation reinforced the sense of institutional control. Dirt, sweat, and wear weren't just makeup effects, they were maintained continuously through filming to reflect the harsh environment. Rosenberg's directing style also gave scenes room to breathe rather than cutting quickly between shots. He often let moments play out in longer takes, giving actors space to build emotional tension organically and letting audiences absorb the oppressive rhythm of prison life. Cool Hand Luke, 1967, tells a deceptively simple story on the surface, but its structure is carefully built to explore endurance, rebellion, and the psychological effects of institutional control. Rather than moving at a fast, plot-heavy pace, it unfolds in a slow, episodic rhythm that mirrors the repetitive, oppressive nature of prison life, and that structure is central to how the story communicates its meaning. The film opens with Luke Jackson, played by Paul Newman, committing a minor act of rebellion, cutting off parking meters while drunk. Right away, this establishes him as someone who resists authority, but not out of calculation or ideology. His actions are impulsive, almost playful, suggesting the conflict with authority is part of who he is rather than a deliberate political stance. After his arrest, he's sent to a southern prison camp and dropped into a rigid hierarchy of punishment and routine labor. The early part of the story follows his adjustment to that world rather than submitting. He starts testing the system's limits almost right away, setting up the film's central tension, Luke against the institution. The story is built around a series of escalating confrontations between Luke and the prison authorities, each one functioning as a psychological test rather than just a plot beat. There's no traditional twist or individualized antagonist here. The prison system itself is the antagonist, expressed through guards, rules, and collective inmate pressure. One of the film's key structural choices is its episodic storytelling. Instead of one continuous arc of escape or conflict, it's built from a series of smaller challenges and punishments of physical labor, escape attempts, disciplinary responses, social interactions are each one reinforcing Luke's identity as a nonconformist while raising the stakes. George Kennedy plays Dragline, who starts out representing the prison's informal power structure, challenging Luke and trying to assert control over him. As the story goes on, though, his role shifts significantly, a part of one of the film's key dynamics, transformation through observation. A turning point comes during the boxing match between Luke and Dragline, which isn't just a physical fight but a symbolic contest for respect and identity. Luke's refusal to give up, even while clearly outmatched, raises his standing within the inmate community and shifts the prison's social structure, establishing him as a figure of admiration. From there, his reputation grows and he starts to be seen as a symbol of resistance, a shift the film uses to explore how systems respond to people who refuse to conform. Luke's defiance becomes both his strength and his burden, drawing more attention and harsher punishment from the authorities. The middle section introduces a series of escape attempts that function as structural markers, each one more complex and consequential than the last. The first is spontaneous and poorly planned, reflecting Luke's impulsiveness, and fails quickly, reinforcing the prison's control. The second is more strategic but still unsuccessful. With each attempt, the film underlines that the system isn't just built to physically contain prisoners, it's designed to wear them down psychologically. That pattern of repeated failure reinforces a theme of institutional inevitability. As the story goes on, its tone shifts from rebellious optimism to mounting tension and fatigue. Luke's energy gets tested not just physically but emotionally, and the film balances moments of humor and camaraderie among inmates against increasingly harsh punishment from the authorities, a contrast that gives the later acts real emotional weight. Strither Martin, as the captain, represents the system's formal authority. He's not constantly on screen, but his presence is always felt, functioning as a stabilizing force that ensures every act of rebellion is met with structured punishment. His character reinforces the idea that the system isn't emotional or reactive, it's procedural and indifferent. The story's major turning point comes when Luke is subjected to repeated punishment after another failed escape. Rather than reinforcing his strength, the punishment starts to break down his psychological resilience, and the narrative slows down to sit with his exhaustion and vulnerability. The final act shifts tone dramatically. Luke's earlier playful defiance gives way to a more desperate kind of resistance, signaling that rebellion within a system like this has real limits. The system doesn't need to defeat Luke through violence. Repetition, exhaustion, and isolation are enough. The film's ending, where Luke's fate is sealed after his final escape and confrontation, serves as both the emotional and structural climax. It doesn't offer a traditional victory or defeat, but a tragic resolution that emphasizes the cost of sustained resistance in an unyielding system. Throughout, the film avoids a conventional three-act structure in favor of a cyclical linear rebellion, punishment, adaptation, escalation, reinforcing the idea that prison life isn't linear but repetitive, and that systems of control are built to absorb and neutralize resistance over time. That structure also highlights the contrast between individual and institutional power. Luke represents unpredictability and spontaneity, the prison represents order and repetition, and the tension of the story comes from these two forces never quite reconciling. By the end, the narrative has completed a full arc from playful rebellion to tragic consequence. Luke's journey is symbolic as much as physical, representing the limits of individual resistance against systemic control. Ultimately, the plot and structure of Cool Hand Luke are inseparable from its meaning. The slow, repetitive, episodic way the story is told is itself a reflection of the world it depicts, making the audience feel the same endurance, frustration, and inevitability that define the characters' lives. Color plays a subtle role too. The dominant tones are earth-eyed browns, yellows, faded greens, are reflecting the natural environment while suggesting decay and wear. The lack of vibrant color reinforces the film's emotional bleakness, and even moments of humor or camaraderie play out within this muted visual world, keeping emotional relief from ever feeling too pronounced. Interior lighting contrasts with exterior scenes. Interiors tend to be darker, with controlled shafts of light through windows or doors, reinforcing the idea that both environments are forms of confinement, just expressed differently: harsh outside, psychologically constricting inside. George Kennedy is often framed within group compositions early on, reflecting the establishment of inmate hierarchy. His character, Dragline, starts visually integrated into the group before becoming more visually distinct as his relationship with Luke evolves, a shift the camera reflects by isolating him more frequently in later scenes. One of the film's important visual strategies is distance. The camera often observes characters from a slight remove rather than using extreme close-ups, creating a sense of observation rather than immersion, as though the audience is watching life unfold within a controlled system. Close-ups are reserved mostly for moments of emotional intensity or punishment, personal realization. The punishment sequences are shot with deliberate restraint rather than graphic detail, emphasizing reaction shots, environmental stillness, and the responses of other inmates, shifting attention from the violence itself toward its psychological and social effects, and reinforcing the idea that institutional punishment is communal and observational, not just physical. One of the film's most iconic visual motifs is Luke's sweat and exhaustion. The camera repeatedly returns to his face as it wears down under heat and labor, turning his physical condition into a visual narrative of endurance that needs no dialogue to communicate. It's written directly onto his body. Depth of composition matters too. Foreground and background elements are carefully arranged to show layers of control, with guards, fences, and watch structures often placed in elevated or peripheral positions to suggest surveillance, while prisoners sit lower or more centrally, reinforcing their exposure and lack of agency. Strither Martin's captain is often shot and controlled. Composed frames reflecting his bureaucratic authority are visually stable, rarely disrupted by chaotic camera movement, a contrast with Luke's more dynamic physical positioning that reinforces the difference between institutional order and individual unpredictability. Symbolically, the film's visual style can be read as a constant tension between openness and restriction. A wide outdoor shots suggest space and possibility, but the framing and human arrangement within them undercut the idea of freedom. Cool Hand Luke, 1967, also uses sound in a subtle but highly effective way, relying less on constant music and more on selective scoring, environmental audio, and silence to shape mood. Unlike many films of its era that lean on continuous orchestral music to guide emotion, it lets scenes breathe naturally, so the moments where music does appear feel more significant. The score, composed by Lalo Schifrin, known for blending jazz, orchestral writing, and modern rhythmic structure, avoids traditional melodrama. Rather than pushing emotional cues at the audience, the music often reflects internal psychological states and environmental tension, aligning with the film's grounded, restrained storytelling. One of the score's most important qualities is its sparing use. Music isn't present in every scene, and that contrast between silence and score heightens its emotional impact when it does appear, usually signaling a shift in tone or a heightened tension, emotional reflection, symbolic weight. That selective scoring lets silence and natural sound carry equal storytelling weight. Environmental sound plays a major role in building realism. Wind, footsteps, chains, distant voices, and labor sounds all build an immersive soundscape reflecting prison life. The clinking of tools during roadwork, the rustling of movement in crowded barracks, the harsh outdoor atmosphere, none of it is just background decoration, it's part of the narrative structure. reinforcing repetition and physical labor. The roadwork sequences in particular carry layered sound design. The rhythmic pounding of tools against asphalt creates an almost musical pattern that becomes symbolic of the prisoner's daily existence, and the lack of variation reinforces the theme of monotony and institutional control, building a subconscious sense of the psychological weight of repetition over time. Silence is another critical tool, used strategically to underline emotional or narrative turning points rather than filling every moment with dialogue or music. The film often lets quiet pauses follow punishment or confrontation, forcing the audience to sit with the emotional consequences. Newman's look is often surrounded by sound contrasts: a lighter, more open sound in scenes of resistance or humor, minimal sound in punishment scenes emphasizing isolation or manipulation of audio perspective that reinforces his emotional journey without needing explicit dialogue. Diegetic sound, a sound originating within the world of the film, matters a great deal here too. Conversations between prisoners, guard commands, and ambient prison activity all build a sense of social structure, and authority is often communicated through sound before it's visually reinforced. Shouted commands from guards establish hierarchy immediately, without extra explanation. Kennedy's dragline is associated with louder, more expressive sound, especially in group settings, contributing to a layered social soundscape of overlapping voices and crowded, controlled cues. A contrast with Luke's more isolated sound moments during punishment or reflection. Strither Martin, by contrast, is defined by calm, controlled vocal delivery that stands out against the cues. His soft but authoritative voice makes him more unsettling, conveying institutional power through certainty and procedural calm rather than volume or aggression, which is part of why his character became so memorable. The famous line about a failure to communicate is a good example of how dialogue and sound work together. Here it's delivered not shouted or emotionally heightened, but with calm finality, and that lack of emotional inflection reinforces the idea that the system isn't emotionally engaged, it's procedural, detached, indifferent. Sifrin's score is often built around simple motifs rather than complex melodies, repeated and slightly varied depending on emotional context, to an approach that mirrors the film's structural repetition, where events and punishments recur in different forms. The music reflects cyclical experience rather than linear progression, sometimes taking a reflective tone during moments of introspection or aftermath, giving the audience room to process emotional consequences rather than dictating emotion outright. Sound also helps establish the physical environment of the prison camp. Heat isn't just visual but auditory, with wind, insects, and distant activity creating a constant atmospheric pressure that reinforces the sense that the prisoners are always within a living system surrounding and containing them. Another important feature of the sound design is its balance between individuality and collectivity. Individual characters are defined partly by how their voices stand out from or blend into the environment. Luke's voice, for instance, is often distinct and calm, while group scenes dissolve individual voices into collective noise, reinforcing the theme of individuality versus system. The absence of music in key scenes is just as meaningful as its presence here. By withholding musical cues during tense or punishing moments, the film forces the audience to engage directly with the raw sound of the environment, creating a more uncomfortable, immersive experience. By the film's final stretch, the soundscape feels emotionally heavier, not because it's louder or more complex, but because the audience has become attuned to its patterns. The repetition of sound elements throughout builds a subconscious familiarity that makes later scenes land harder, even without added musical emphasis. Cool Hand Luke, 1967, was released into a rapidly changing cinematic and cultural landscape, and its reception reflected both the strength of the film itself and the shifting expectations of late 1960s audiences. American cinema at the time was moving away from the rigid studio system toward more character-driven, morally complex storytelling, and the film arrived just as audiences were ready for protagonists who were flawed, resistant, and emotionally ambiguous. On release, it drew strong attention from critics and general audiences alike. Many reviewers praised Paul Newman's central performance, who by then already considered one of Hollywood's most important leading men, for its quiet defiance without theatrical exaggeration, widely seen as one of his most controlled and emotionally precise roles, reinforcing his reputation for combining charisma with real depth. George Kennedy's supporting performance drew major praise as well, with critics noting how his character shifts from antagonistic hierarchy figure to Luke's loyal follower, a transformation seen as emotionally powerful and structurally important to the film's overall impact. That performance earned him major industry recognition and helped elevate him from supporting roles to real Hollywood visibility. Strither Martin's performance also drew attention, especially for its calm, controlled portrayal of institutional authority. Critics praised his delivery, especially in key dialogue scenes, for its unsettling restraint. Rather than a typical loud antagonist, he embodied a system that enforces control through order and procedure, and critics often described his presence as chilling precisely because of that emotional neutrality. Stuart Rosenberg's direction was widely acknowledged too. Reviewers noted that his television background contributed to the film's grounded, efficient storytelling, with an emphasis on performance, pacing, and emotional realism over flashy technique. Some critics praised this restraint, others felt certain sections dragged. Even those less enthusiastic about the pacing, though, generally acknowledged the effectiveness of its atmosphere. Conrad L. Hall's cinematography was another frequently highlighted element in early reviews. Critics praised how the film captured heat, light, and environmental harshness, often describing the visual texture as immersive and almost tactile, and crediting the natural lighting and outdoor shooting with making the prison feel authentic rather than constructed. Hall's work was widely seen as elevating the film beyond standard prison drama aesthetics. Lalo Schifrin's score got more mixed commentary, as some critics appreciated its restraint and avoidance of overly emotional orchestration, while others felt the minimal use of music left some emotional transitions feeling understated. Over time, though, the score came to be appreciated as part of the film's broader minimalist, realistic approach. Cool Hand Luke, 1967, is often remembered simply as a prison drama, but its real power comes from its layered themes and dense symbolism. Beneath the surface story of a man resisting authority is a broader meditation on individuality, institutional power, faith, suffering, and the human need for meaning, a symbolism that isn't decorative but woven into everyday actions, objects, and recurring patterns of behavior. One central theme is the conflict between individuality and institutional control. Luke Jackson represents the individual who refuses to be reshaped by systems of authority, while the prison represents the institutional world, a structured, repetitive, designed to eliminate unpredictability. The tension between these two forces drives the film's entire emotional and philosophical core. Luke's resistance isn't ideological in any traditional political sense. He never delivers a manifesto or articulates a belief system. Instead, his individuality comes through in behavior, small acts of refusal, humor in the face of punishment, a refusal to internalize shame. That makes him symbolic as much as realistic, or a representation of human unpredictability itself. Another major theme is the illusion of control. The prison system believes it can regulate behavior through punishment, routine, and hierarchy, but the film keeps showing that control is never absolute. Even physically restrained, Luke holds on to his psychological independence, creating a contrast between physical confinement and mental freedom. The prison can restrict movement, but it struggles to fully suppress identity. Endurance ties closely into this theme, and it's not heroic in the usual sense. It's repetitive, often painful. The famous roadwork scene captures it directly, Prisoners break asphalt under the sun only to watch the cycle continue endlessly. The labor becomes symbolic of meaningless work within rigid systems, designed not for progress but for submission through exhaustion. One of the most important symbols is the egg-eating challenge, where Luke eats an extraordinary number of boiled eggs in a short time, a moment that becomes legendary within the prison. On the surface it's a test of physical stamina, but symbolically it represents the absurdity of proving worth through arbitrary systems. The challenge has no real purpose beyond domination and humiliation, yet Luke turns it into a victory of will. Strather Martin's captain represents bureaucratic authority. He's not a villain in the emotional sense, he symbolizes institutional logic. His calm explanations of rules and punishment reflect a system that believes itself rational and justified. And this is where one of the film's most famous ideas comes through. Authority doesn't need anger to enforce control, only procedure. His famous line about a failure to communicate becomes a statement about the disconnect between individuals and systems. The system can't truly hear the individual, and the individual can't fully communicate within the system's language. That breakdown isn't accidental, it's structural. The system isn't built for understanding, only compliance. Another key theme is the performance of masculinity under pressure. The prison becomes a stage where strength, endurance, and emotional restraint are constantly tested, and characters perform toughness not just to survive authority but to earn respect from other inmates, creating a layered social structure where identity is constantly negotiated through physical and emotional display. The boxing match between Luke and Dragline becomes a symbolic ritual rather than just a fight, testing hierarchy, respect, and identity within the inmate community. Luke's refusal to submit, even while outmatched, turns the match into a symbolic victory, not about winning outright, but about refusing psychological defeat. Religious symbolism runs through the film too, particularly around suffering and martyr-like endurance. Luke is often positioned as a Christ-like figure within the inmate community. The film never states this outright, but he suffers repeatedly, and his suffering becomes a source of inspiration for others, who start to find meaning in his resistance even as it leads to his physical breakdown. Other characters' reactions to him reinforce this symbolic reading. He becomes more than an individual, an idea projected onto him by others, reflecting a broader theme that individuals are often turned into symbols by the communities watching them, sometimes well beyond their own intentions. Freedom is another complicated theme. At first it looks like physical escape. Luke keeps trying to break out, suggesting freedom exists outside the system. But as the film goes on, each attempt brings harsher consequences, suggesting physical escape alone isn't enough to achieve real freedom. That leads to a more subtle idea: freedom as an internal state. Even confined, Luke holds on to a sense of self the prison can't fully control. His humor, defiance, and refusal to internalize defeat suggest freedom can exist mentally even when physical liberty is restricted. Though the film also questions how sustainable that internal freedom really is under extreme pressure. The imagery of chains, fences, and roadwork tools recurs as symbols of constraint, are not just practical elements of prison life but visual reminders of control, with the repetition of labor scenes reinforcing how systems of authority rely on routine as much as punishment. The environment itself becomes symbolic. Harsh sunlight, open roads, and dusty surroundings contrast with the prison's enclosed spaces, creating a visual metaphor where even open spaces leave the prisoners constrained. The world outside the prison doesn't represent simple freedom, it's still part of the same system of labor and control. Laughter and humor form another subtle symbolic layer, functioning not just as entertainment but as a survival mechanism. Luke's jokes and playful behavior are a form of resistance through emotional unpredictability within a system that values obedience and seriousness. Humor becomes a disruptive force. Cool Hand Luke, 1967, leans heavily on visual storytelling as one of its most powerful tools. Its cinematography doesn't rely on elaborate effects or stylistic experimentation, instead it builds meaning through composition, natural light, environmental contrast, and deliberate restraint in camera movement, creating a visual language that feels grounded, oppressive, and emotionally immersive, reinforcing the film's themes of endurance and institutional control. Cinematographer Conrad L. Hall was central to shaping that visual identity, and his work here helped establish his reputation as one of American cinema's most influential cinematographers. Hall favored naturalism, available light, real environments, subtle camera adjustments rather than heavily built studio lighting, giving the film a documentary-like realism even in carefully staged scenes. One of its defining visual elements is heat and light. The Florida sun becomes almost a character in itself, and its harsh brightness works symbolically as an oppressive force. The camera lingers on sweat, dust, and exhausted faces during the roadwork scenes, conveying physical toll even before any real action happens. The framing consistently plays with confinement versus openness. Even outdoors, characters are often framed with fences, guards, or symmetrical groupings that suggest restriction, and prisoners are frequently shown in organized lines or clusters that echo the system's desire for order. This contrast between open landscapes and controlled human arrangement creates a visual paradox. Freedom exists physically but is denied structurally. Paul Newman's Luke is often framed differently from the other prisoners who early on, the camera tends to isolate him within the frame, highlighting his individuality and separation from institutional order, while as the film progresses the framing gets tighter and more restrictive, visually reflecting the mounting pressure on his character. Camera movement stays generally restrained rather than fast-tracking shots or dramatic angles. It holds steady, letting scenes unfold naturally. That stillness reinforces a sense of inevitability, mirroring the repetitive structure of prison life where each day resembles the last, and movement, when it does occur, tends to be purposeful and emotionally charged, as in escape attempts or punishment scenes. The roadwork sequences are among the most visually significant, often captured in long, horizontal shots of prisoners breaking asphalt under the sun, emphasizing repetition and collective labor over individual action, with the symmetry of men working in lines reinforcing systemic control, and dust and heat haze softening the image to enhance the sense of exhaustion. Audience reception was generally strong, especially among younger viewers engaged with the era's cultural shifts. Luke Jackson became a symbolic figure of resistance and individuality, and many viewers read the film not just as a prison story but as a broader metaphor for resisting authority in everyday life, an interpretation that helped it gain momentum beyond traditional cinema audiences. It wasn't without criticism, though. Some reviewers found the pacing too slow and episodic, especially compared to more conventional, action-driven prison escape films, and the lack of a fast-moving plot was seen by some as a weakness. The film's ambiguity was another point of debate because Luke isn't presented as a fully explained ideological figure. Some critics felt it lacked a clear moral or political stance. Many appreciated that openness, others found it frustrating. The film never explicitly defines whether Luke's rebellion is heroic, self-destructive, or purely symbolic, leaving that interpretation to the audience. Despite the early criticism, the film's reputation kept growing, and it became increasingly clear that its strengths lay precisely in the elements some early critics had questioned: either the slow pacing, repetitive structure, and minimalist storytelling came to be understood as deliberate artistic choices reinforcing its themes. Its Academy recognition helped solidify its industry standing, and while George Kennedy received the most prominent award, the film as a whole came to be seen as a significant achievement in performance-driven storytelling. Newman's performance continued to be cited among his greatest roles, reinforcing his status as one of the defining actors of his generation. As time passed, critical re-evaluation grew more favorable. Later scholars and critics emphasized its influence on New Hollywood cinema, where character complexity and thematic ambiguity became more common, and the film came to be seen as part of a transitional moment in American filmmaking, bridging classic studio-era storytelling with more modern, psychologically driven narratives. In retrospect, many critics have pointed to how the film's reception evolved. What was once seen as slow or understated came to be recognized as deliberate and immersive. What was once considered minimalist came to be understood as thematically consistent. The film's reputation grew not through immediate consensus, but through gradual cultural and critical reassessment. Even the character of Luke evolved in critical interpretation over time. Early reviews often focused on his rebellious charm, while later analysis emphasized his symbolic role as an individual resisting systemic control, reflecting broader shifts in how audiences and critics read anti-hero narratives. Cool Hand Luke, 1967, has left a legacy that reaches well past its original release, shaping prison dramas, broader cinematic storytelling, character archetypes, and cultural expressions of rebellion. Over time, it's become one of those rare films remembered not just for its narrative but continually reinterpreted by new generations of viewers and filmmakers. One major part of its legacy is the cool rebel archetype it created and reinforced through Paul Newman's Luke Jackson, defined not by loud rebellion or ideological speeches, but by calm, persistent resistance to authority. Luke's humor, emotional control, and refusal to submit became a template for countless later characters, and the idea of a protagonist who resists systems without fully articulating a political framework became deeply influential in modern storytelling. The film also helped shift prison cinema as a genre. Before its release, prison films often focused on escape plots or moral lessons about crime and punishment. Afterward, the genre began leaning towards psychological and sociological exploration. Later works like The Shawshank Redemption picked up similar themes of endurance, institutional control, and symbolic resistance, each with its own identity, but with the emotional and thematic groundwork this film laid clearly visible underneath. Strither Martin's iconic portrayal of institutional authority became part of the legacy too. His calm, procedural delivery influenced how authority figures get portrayed in cinema, reinforcing the idea that systemic power is often scariest when it's calm, rational, and emotionally detached, a trope that shows up repeatedly in later films and TV about institutional systems. His famous line about a failure to communicate entered popular culture and stayed there for decades, quoted and referenced across political commentary, workplace conversation, and media analyses, a proof of how a single line of dialogue can outgrow its original context. The film's influence on performance style matters too. George Kennedy's restrained approach, particularly his transformation from antagonist to emotional supporter, showed how supporting characters can carry real emotional weight, influencing later portrayals of secondary characters who undergo significant moral or emotional change. Conrad L. Hall's cinematography left its own lasting mark on visual storytelling. His use of natural light, environmental realism, and textured outdoor imagery influenced generations of cinematographers, and the visual language of heat, dust, and labor became tied to realism in American films dealing with hardship and institutional environments. The film's influence on New Hollywood cinema is significant as well, helping bridge the gap between the polished, studio-driven filmmaking of earlier decades and the more character-focused, thematically complex storytelling that followed. Filmmakers in the 1970s drew on its willingness to slow down and focus on psychological depth over constant plot movement. Beyond direct cinematic influence, the film has had a strong presence in pop culture more broadly. Scenes like the egg-eating challenge and the roadwork sequences have been referenced in TV, advertising, and reality competition formats, often detached from their original context and reused as cultural shorthand for endurance and stubborn determination. Luke Jackson himself became a cultural symbol of resiliency. His calm refusal to submit shows up in motivational contexts, sports commentary, and business rhetoric, and the phrase "cool under pressure" is closely tied to his character, reinforcing the idea that emotional control under pressure is its own form of strength. Over time, Luke has become less a film character and more an archetypal figure representing human persistence generally. The film's reach extends into music and visual art too. Rock and folk artists in later decades drew on its themes of individuality and resistance, and album art, music videos, and stage performances have echoed its imagery of confinement, labor, and solitary endurance, even without direct reference. Lalo Schifrin's musical approach shaped how later composers handled tension and minimalism in film scoring rather than overwhelming emotional cues. Later scores often adopted a more subtle, atmospheric approach, reflecting this film's influence on sound design philosophy. Part of the film's legacy is simply how well it's held up across decades. Unlike films that date due to stylistic choices or cultural specificity, this one keeps resonating because its core themes are universal. The struggle between individuality and authority, the experience of endurance under pressure, and the search for meaning within restrictive systems are all ideas that stay relevant. Scholars often point to its cyclical structure and minimalist storytelling as key reasons for that lasting influence. By avoiding overly specific political messaging, it lets each generation interpret it through its own lens, which has helped keep it a classic rather than a historical artifact. It's also shaped audience expectations for anti-hero narratives more broadly. Modern protagonists in film and TV often carry elements of Luke Jackson's character: emotional restraint, quiet defiance, moral ambiguity. A shift in character design that traces in part back to this film and others of its era. The contrast between uniforms and authority figures matters to guards and supervisors, including Strither Martin's captain, wear more structured, clean, distinct clothing, reinforcing the hierarchy. Prisoners are visually homogenized while authority figures stand visually apart, emphasizing control and separation. Costume also plays a subtle role in differentiating characters among the prisoners. Though the uniforms are identical, small variations in how they're worn, how clean they are, and their physical condition signal personality, status, and experience. More dominant inmates tend to look more relaxed or confident, while newer or weaker prisoners appear more rigid or disheveled. Small variations that let identity emerge within uniformity. The prison's set design is just as important in establishing tone. The yard, bunk areas, and work sites feel functional rather than stylized. There's no attempt to romanticize the environment. Structures are plain, repetitive, utilitarian, reinforcing that the prison isn't built for comfort or individuality but for efficiency and control. The outdoor work environments, particularly the road construction scenes, are designed to emphasize exposure and labor. The open landscape might suggest freedom at first glance, but the arrangement of prisoners in supervised lines transforms the space into another form of controlled environment. The set design uses openness. Paradoxically, even in vast spaces, the characters stay confined by structure and organization. The barracks and indoor spaces feel crowded and restrictive, with bunk beds arranged in tight formations that minimize personal space, reinforcing the psychological impact of confinement, where even rest is shared, monitored, and structured. The lack of privacy becomes a visual metaphor for lost individuality. The captain's presence within these environments is reinforced by set design that places authority in elevated or centralized positions. Supervisory structures, watch points, and controlled access areas visually separate authority from prisoners, reinforcing the power imbalance without needing dialogue. Dragline, George Kennedy, is often positioned within group spaces that reflect inmate hierarchy early on, visually integrated into prison society and often surrounded by other inmates, emphasizing his influence as his character evolves. His positioning within the frame and set shifts too, reflecting his changing relationship with authority and with Luke. Lighting is carefully coordinated with the environment. Outdoor sets lean on natural sunlight, creating harsh contrast and deep shadows that emphasize physical strain and exposure, while indoor sets use more controlled, dimmer lighting that reinforces the psychological pressure of enclosed spaces. One of the most important aspects of the set design is its lack of personalization. There are very few decorative elements suggesting individuality or personal ownership, and that absence is intentional, reinforcing the idea that the prison system strips away personal identity. Everything is shared, controlled, or standardized. Even individual objects are tools. Chains, benches, fences are functional rather than symbolic on their own, but together form a symbolic system of control, and their constant presence throughout the film reinforces the idea that the environment itself is part of the system of authority. The roadwork tools in particular recur as visual elements tying physical movement to institutional structure and not individualized objects, but part of a system that treats labor as routine and interchangeable. Fences, gates, and barriers are another key design element, and not just physical obstacles but visual reminders of separation that appear repeatedly in the background, subtly reinforcing confinement even when characters aren't directly interacting with them. Newman's Luke is often framed within these environments in ways that highlight contrast, frequently positioned near structural boundaries like fences or open road edges, emphasizing his constant proximity to both escape and restriction, reinforcing his identity as someone defined by resistance to boundaries. Cool Hand Luke, 1967, is widely celebrated not just for its performances and visual style but for its sharp, memorable, and thematically rich screenplay. The dialogue is carefully built to reflect hierarchy, resistance, and psychological tension within the prison, and rather than relying on constant exposition, the script leans on minimalism, repetition, and strategically placed iconic lines to build meaning. One of the script's most important qualities is restraint. Characters don't constantly explain their emotions or motivations. Instead, much of the meaning comes through behavior, tone, and subtext. That lets the dialogue feel natural and grounded while giving the audience room to interpret character intentions, and the writing avoids unnecessary complexity in favor of clarity and impact. Luke Jackson is written with relatively sparse dialogue compared to many protagonists of the era. He often speaks in short, direct sentences reflecting his independent, emotionally controlled nature, and his dialogue frequently carries a tone of calm defiance rather than overt rebellion. This choice reinforces the idea that Luke doesn't need to explain his resistance. It's expressed through action and presence rather than speech. One of the screenplay's more distinctive features is its use of institutional language. Authority figures, particularly the captain, speak in structured, procedural dialogue that reflects the system they represent, calm, methodical, and emotionally detached. That contrast between institutional language and individual expression creates a strong thematic divide throughout the film. The captain's famous communications speech is one of the most iconic examples of the writing at work, a simple phrasing carrying deep symbolic weight, reflecting not just a misunderstanding between individuals but a fundamental structural breakdown between authority and subject. The calm delivery of such a powerful idea makes it more unsettling still, suggesting institutional control doesn't need emotional intensity, only procedural certainty. The screenplay also uses repetition as both a narrative and thematic device. Certain phrases, commands, and expressions recur throughout, reinforcing the cyclical nature of prison life. This repetition mirrors the characters' daily routines and underlines the lack of progression within the system, reinforcing the psychological impact of institutional structure, where language itself becomes part of control. Dragline's dialogue evolves over the course of the film. Early on, his speech reflects confidence, dominance, and alignment with the internal prison hierarchy, assertive and competitive, and as his relationship with Luke develops, his dialogue shifts toward admiration and emotional openness, reflecting his internal transformation. The script balances humor and seriousness carefully. A lot of the inmates trade casual banter, jokes, and playful insults, and that humor serves several purposes of providing emotional relief, building camaraderie, and highlighting the resilience of human connection even within an oppressive system. But the humor never fully undermines the seriousness of the setting. It coexists with tension and punishment, creating a layered emotional tone. One of the script's strengths is how it shifts tone without abrupt transitions. As scenes often move from light-hearted interaction to sudden disciplinary action or emotional intensity, reflecting the unpredictability of prison life, where moments of normality can be interrupted by authority at any time. Luke's dialogue is often set against silence here. In many key moments, he chooses not to respond verbally, communicating instead through expression or action. That selective use of speech reinforces his character as someone who resists being defined or controlled through language, and his silence often carries as much meaning as his words, creating a dual layer of communication in the script. Strither Martin's dialogue is particularly important in building thematic meaning. His lines emphasize rules, consequences, and procedure in a way that creates a sense of inevitability, as though the outcomes he describes are predetermined functions of the system rather than personal choices. The writing also contrasts individual and group dialogue. When prisoners speak collectively, the dialogue becomes layered and overlapping, reflecting the prison's chaotic social structure, while individual dialogue moments are more focused and deliberate. A distinction that reinforces the tension between individuality and collective identity. The egg-eating challenge scene is another strong example of the script's structure. The dialogue is minimal but effective, with much of the tension carried through short exchanges, reactions, and escalating verbal encouragement or provocation. The simplicity of the dialogue lets the physical action take center stage while still keeping the psychological stakes present. Newman's delivery style plays a big role in how the script lands. His calm, measured speech gives even simple lines real emotional weight, and the script is built to accommodate that style, leaving space between lines and avoiding unnecessary verbal clutter, creating a rhythm that feels natural yet tightly controlled. The screenplay also avoids excessive exposition. Background information about characters is rarely explained directly. Instead, the audience learns about relationships, hierarchies, and motivations through interaction, strengthening immersion since viewers have to actively interpret behavior rather than passively receive information. Understatement is another important element. Many emotionally significant moments are written with minimal dialogue, relying on implication instead, enhancing emotional impact since the audience has to read between the lines to fully understand a scene. The character interactions throughout are carefully structured to reflect shifting power dynamics. A dialogue often changes depending on context, location, and who's present, and a character's tone in front of guards may differ significantly from their tone among fellow prisoners, reflecting the layered nature of communication within controlled environments. Cool Hand Luke, 1967, was released during a transitional period in Hollywood marketing, as studios began moving away from purely studio-controlled publicity toward more modern, audience-driven strategies. It didn't have a massive multimedia campaign by later standards, but its marketing was highly effective for its time, relying on strong imagery, star power, and thematic intrigue to draw audiences in. A central piece of the promotional strategy was Paul Newman himself. By the mid-1960s he was already a major box office draw known for his charisma and his knack for playing complex, rebellious characters. and marketing materials leaned heavily on his presence, often framing him as the embodiment of cool defiance. Posters and promotional images frequently highlighted his expressions, calm demeanor, and physical presence, reinforcing the idea of a strong-willed individual resisting authority. The promotional posters typically used stark, high-contrast imagery, a Luke in his prison uniform, sometimes alone, sometimes surrounded by other inmates or prison structures, visuals designed to immediately communicate themes of confinement and resistance. The simplicity of the imagery let audiences understand the film's emotional tone without much explanation. The taglines emphasized rebellion, endurance, and individuality rather than plot details, with promotional text often centered on Luke's refusal to submit, positioning the film not as a conventional prison story but as a character-driven drama about personal strength and defiance. George Kennedy's presence also showed up in promotional materials, particularly after early screenings highlighted his strong performance here. While he wasn't the initial marketing focus, his role became increasingly important to word-of-mouth promotion as audiences responded to his character arc, and promotional emphasis on the ensemble performance grew over time. Critical reviews and early audience reactions played a big role in the marketing too. A positive word-of-mouth helped sustain interest after release, and at a time when television advertising for films was still developing, theatrical trailers and newspaper ads were the main promotional tools, making critical reception and audience response especially influential. The trailer leaned heavily on mood over detailed storytelling rather than revealing plot points. It emphasized atmosphere, prison life, physical labor, tension between inmates and authority, and Luke's calm resistance, building curiosity without giving away the story and encouraging audiences to experience it in theaters. Lalo Schifrin's music was subtly worked into promotional materials as well. Its distinctive tone contributed to the film's identity, and in some contexts music was used to reinforce the emotional mood of rebellion and tension. Though marketing didn't lean on the soundtrack as heavily as it did on visuals and performance, studio marketing also highlighted the film's literary origin, noting its adaptation from a novel, positioning it as more serious and substantial than standard commercial entertainment, appealing to audiences drawn to dramatic, character-driven storytelling over pure action. The imagery of prison labor, especially the roadwork scenes, recurred throughout the marketing materials, communicating both physical hardship and symbolic resistance, and the contrast between harsh outdoor environments and human endurance became a central visual theme used to draw audiences in. As the film gained attention, its marketing shifted slightly to emphasize its critical success and award recognition, particularly highlighting George Kennedy's growing prominence in the promotional narrative. The award recognition helped sustain the film's visibility well beyond its initial release window. Unlike modern films that lean heavily on television spots, digital campaigns, and merchandising, Cool Hand Luke's promotion stayed more focused and traditional, relying on the theatrical experience, print media, and cultural word-of-mouth, letting its reputation grow organically through audience engagement rather than constant media saturation. Its imagery continued to be used long after release, to the visual identity of Luke Jackson, calm expression, prison uniform, defiant posture, became iconic in film history, reused across retrospectives, anniversary promotions, and home video releases, reinforcing its long-term cultural presence. The film's promotional success also demonstrates the power of character-driven marketing over spectacle or special effects. The campaign focused on emotional identity and thematic tension, an approach that proved highly effective and went on to influence how later dramatic films built around strong central performances were marketed. Over time, the marketing identity of Cool Hand Luke grew into something bigger than its original campaign, becoming associated with ideas of rebellion, endurance, and individuality in popular culture. Even people who hadn't seen the film often recognized its imagery and themes through repeated cultural references. Cool Hand Luke, 1967, stands as a defining entry in the prison drama genre, and its influence becomes even clearer when set against earlier films, later reinterpretations, and other work by its own creative team. Through comparison, its distinctive narrative structure, thematic depth, and character focus come into sharper view, especially in how it reshaped expectations for stories about incarceration and rebellion. Before this film, many prison-based narratives in American cinema tended to focus on external action rather than internal psychology. Earlier prison films often emphasized escape plots, moral correction, or crime and punishment frameworks, with the prison functioning mainly as a setting for tension and resolution rather than a complex social system. Cool Hand Luke shifts the focus inward, treating the prison not just as a physical space but as a psychological environment that shapes identity over time. Compared to later films like The Shawshank Redemption, the thematic similarities are clearer. Both explore endurance under institutional control and the idea of hope within confinement, but the tone differs significantly. While later films often lean toward emotional uplift or long-term optimism, Cool Hand Luke keeps a more ambiguous, restrained emotional register, never fully resolving its central conflict in a traditionally hopeful way and instead leaving viewers with a more complicated reflection on resistance and consequence. There's also a useful comparison to earlier prison or chain gang films from the 1930s and 40s, which tended to depict imprisonment through a more straightforward moral framework, with characters either redeemed or punished in clear narrative arcs. Luke Jackson, by contrast, is neither fully redeemed nor simply punished. His character occupies a morally and psychologically ambiguous space that reflects American cinema's broader shift toward more complex protagonists. The film also differs meaningfully from traditional Western genre films, even while sharing some thematic DNA with them. Like Western protagonists, Luke is a lone figure resisting systems of authority, but where Westerns often use the landscape to symbolize freedom and frontier possibility, Cool Hand Luke's open spaces like the roadwork situs paradoxically function as extensions of control rather than freedom. That inversion of genre expectations underlines the film's more modern, pessimistic worldview. Compared to Paul Newman's other roles, like The Hustler and HUD, a consistent pattern shows up. Newman often played men who were talented, charismatic, and resistant to authority but emotionally isolated. Luke Jackson differs in that his isolation isn't rooted in ambition or personal flaw alone, but in systemic confrontation, making him less self-destructive and more symbolic, representing resistance itself rather than individual moral failure. Luke also contrasts with other cinematic rebels of the 1960s and 70s. In many new Hollywood films, rebellion ties into social breakdown or countercultural ideology, but in Cool Hand Luke it's more existential than political. Luke never articulates a broader social vision, he simply refuses to be broken, which makes his resistance more universal but also more abstract than many later cinematic rebels. George Kennedy's dragline can be compared to other covert characters in cinema, figures who shift from opposition to admiration of the protagonist. But what sets dragline apart is the emotional sincerity of the transformation. It's not built on ideology or persuasion but on witnessing endurance, giving the relationship between Luke and dragline a more experiential, emotional foundation than many similar dynamics elsewhere. Compared to films about institutional authority, like military dramas or workplace hierarchy stories, this film stands out for depicting authority as procedural rather than personal. The captain doesn't represent personal villainy but systemic logic, which differs from films where antagonists are individualized and emotionally driven. Here, authority is impersonal, which makes it harder to resist and harder to defeat. Conrad L. Hall's cinematography also holds up well against other films of the era. While many 1960s films were experimenting with visual style, this one leans on naturalistic lighting and environmental realism in a way that feels closer to documentary filmmaking than the more stylized work of the period, a restrained approach that strengthens its thematic focus on realism and endurance. Lalo Schifrin's score differs from many contemporaneous film scores too. While other films of the era often reached for sweeping orchestral music to guide emotional response, this score stays more restrained and rhythmic, functioning less as emotional instruction and more as atmospheric reinforcement, in keeping with the film's overall minimalist approach. Compared to modern reinterpretations of prison narratives, the film maintains a slower, more deliberate pace.